That was a clip from Armor of Light, a documentary that features Reverend Robert Schenck, who's with us on the panel today. We'll hear more about his position on gun control and dealing with drug violence. Let me just say, or gun violence, in just a moment. Let me just say one thing. Ada's story was so visceral and real and authentic, don't you think? Do not think for a moment that this is the policy wonk panel that follows the authentic, real story. That's not how Tina rolls, okay? There is just as much direct connection to the kinds of stories that you just heard from Ada in each one of these people. I'm going to tell you just a little about each one, and over the course of the conversation, you're going to learn a lot more, and why these people who, but for guns, would probably be total strangers, or they would be friends in a completely other context, but because of guns and the way we think about guns in the United States, that intersection has brought them here today with some very important issues that we're going to discuss. Sandy Phillips, you would have no particular relationship to a gun, but for the fact that your daughter decided to go to the movies in Aurora, Colorado in 2012.
Well, we are gun owners. I used to hunt with my parents, used to shoot, trap, and skeet. And that was my only relationship with gun, and certainly not in any way associated with gun violence. So yes, if my daughter hadn't gone to the movie, I wonder what I would be doing today.
And we'll find out more about that in just a moment. Reverend Robert Schenck, you're an evangelical pastor. What are your passions?
My passions first are for my wife, my family, my community, but especially in terms of the church community. It's what I've done with the entirety of my adult life. I became an evangelical Christian at age 17, and I've been on that track, trained as an evangelical minister, ordained, and now chair one of the oldest associations of evangelical clergy in the country. So it's really the organizing factor of my life. And
you're a gun violence activist.
Most certainly am, and it's defining pretty much everything that I do at this moment. And there's some risk in my community, and I think we'll probably explore the reasons behind that, but it's certain some things are worth taking big risks for.
David Kennedy is a criminologist here at John Jay. Welcome, David. How are you not an academic?
Not smart enough? I think the answer you're looking for is try to be street savvy. And so the question is, what ties us together? I think what ties us together is an absolute, visceral, passionate commitment that people, whether as individuals or as communities, should not get up every day afraid that they and their families and their loved ones are going to be shot and killed. And 30 years ago, pretty much by accident, I started a decade that pretty much brought me to the worst drug markets at the height of the crack era all across the country. And I spent those 10 years walking drug markets. And in settings like this, I always have to say, I was there in a professional capacity, unlike all the other white folks I saw out there. And I saw neighborhoods that were just saturated in fear and violence. And in a lot of these places, you could be in well-off white neighborhoods and practically hold your breath and walk to these places where the level of violence and victimization and fear and young men in wheelchairs because they were not dead but had survived, it was just the way people lived. And that's wrong, it's un-American, it's unacceptable, and I'm part of a big national community trying to do something about that.
Kenneth Thompson, district attorney for my neighborhood, Brooklyn, New York. How do you deal with that fear in the people that you serve?
Well, the way I deal with it is to increase my determination to do something about the gun violence that has so many people in Brooklyn and all over the country in jeopardy. We have 11,000 Americans murdered with guns every year. And what gets most of the attention are these mass shootings, which are horrific in nature. But what fuels America's gun violence or the homicide rate is the slaughter of black men day after day on the streets of our cities. And we need to be honest about it. And we need to call on Congress to stand up and do what is right. Because these guns have us all in jeopardy. So I acknowledge the fear, but I'm more determined to do something about these guns that are coming into New York City, into places like Chicago and Baltimore, from states down south. Guns that are flooding our cities, guns that are being brought in by these merchants of death. We have to do something about it.
So, Sandy, I can imagine a time when you would be listening to District Attorney Ken Thompson, and that would be something far away. That would be an issue that, you know, something very important on the news, and you would care about it, but it didn't necessarily intersect with your life.
Yes, I often feel great guilt that after Columbine, I didn't do something. I said somebody has to do something. Didn't realize I was the person that needed to do something.
And that was just down the road from you in suburban
Exactly,
Denver.
exactly. But like he says, now that I know what I know and have experienced the loss that I've experienced, when you lose 72 people in a weekend in Chicago, that's not acceptable. As America, it doesn't matter if they're gang-related, it doesn't matter if they're innocent standing on a corner or sitting on their front porch, they're getting slaughtered, and that's not okay.
One minute, your daughter's alive. The next minute, she's gone.
Yeah.
What's that transition like?
There are no words for it. You just hear that news. We heard it through a phone call from the young man that was with her in the theater, and he called, and I remember looking at my phone and wondering why I was getting a phone call, because I knew they were at the movies. And I picked up the phone and I could hear the screaming going on in the background. And I said, "What's wrong? What's going on?" And he said, "There's been a shooting, and I think I've been shot twice." And as he's telling me this, I'm realizing that Jessi isn't on the phone. And I said, "Where's Jessi?" And he said, "I tried." And I said, "Is she okay? Tell me she's okay." And he said, "I tried." And I said, "Just tell me she's not dead." And at that point, from what my husband tells me, I started screaming. And from that instant, our world spiraled out of control. And we knew literally almost instantly that we were going to be involved in this issue, because I couldn't understand how this could happen again and again and again in America, and that there hadn't been any stopgaps made. So it took a lot of research, took a lot of gathering knowledge, and here we are 4 years later, and hearing that our Democratic candidates are talking about gun violence prevention. So we're pretty proud of that.
Now, Reverend Schenck, as an evangelical minister, how do you respond to someone with the kind of tragedy that Sandy experienced?
First of all, I think our community should be the one that reaches out with the greatest amount of compassion, concern, and intervention. It's just a fact that the evangelical church has been, I believe, very much on the wrong side of this equation. We are the least likely religious group to support any kind of restrictions on gun access, gun use. We are the religious group, certainly one of the top, with access, immediate access to guns, ownership of guns. I don't think
Can we
understand.
explore that for just a second? What is it? Is it a conservatism? Is it a kind of libertarianism? Is it a terrible swift sword idea that better keep that rifle or pistol around the house because I never, you never know when the, I don't know, when the Philistines are going to show up or something?
Well, the truth is often said in jest, and I will say all of those things factor in. I do think that there's a very serious one, and I call it a moral, ethical, and even theological crisis in our community, and it's focused on fear. Fear of the future, fear of persecution, fear of the government, fear of those who might target us as a religious minority, even though we arguably are 30% of the population. All those things I think factor in, but most of all, I'm addressing, and we do this in the film. It was Abigail Disney who first challenged me to come out. I'm an outlier. I'm taking a lot of risk going up against this orthodoxy in my community. But I think it's in direct contradiction to our Christian principles. I think it certainly contradicts the teaching and model of Jesus Christ. And my greatest passion, if you will, the focus of my work at the moment in this regard is to separate our evangelical community from what I think has been a very spiritually, morally, and ethically corrupting influence of the NRA and Gun Owners of America and the other gun culture. I think it nullifies what is the essence of our message. So, big job. But
Let me talk a little bit about what I think is, and it's easy to blame the NRA, but you recall the incident where a shooter went to Colorado Springs at a health clinic that was involved with abortions. And that is an issue that you have strong feelings about, right?
Very much so.
Mike Huckabee, a presidential candidate who describes himself as an evangelical, who was pressed on the issue of what happened in Colorado Springs, was asked after that event in which people lost their lives, innocent people lost their lives, do evangelicals condemn the killing in this shooting? And he said something very interesting, which I think constitutes the sort of moral conundrum of the evangelical community as it's often expressed. We, of course, condemn killing. We condemn killing of any kind, just like we condemn the killing inside that clinic when it involves the killing of innocents who are aborted fetuses, who are people that God, loves just like anyone else. Does that moral equivalence have any place in the evangelical church?
I don't think that was a helpful answer. I think that was a political answer.
Yeah,
and that is part of the problem here, because when you look at historic Christian moral and ethical reflection, there is a rich body there, and there is an argument to be made, and I entered this whole conversation on the basis that I am a pro-life advocate. That means I respect the sanctity of every human life, not some. And we have to bring into the discussion in my community, we must bring race into the conversation. It's a very uncomfortable, very difficult one, but we have a history of it. There's a part of the history of American evangelicalism is the separation between the white and black churches, right at the inception of our movement, which created modern American evangelicalism. And in the white community, white churches, we're very uncomfortable discussing that topic. It's unresolved, and it's part of this discussion. So all of that has to be brought to bear, and that kind of truncated political response is supremely unhelpful at this time.
How many people saw the images of the folks in Oregon who, but for their automatic weapons, and maybe they still did to some of you, but a fairly forlorn situation that doesn't immediately inspire freedom. These guys in Oregon out in the middle of the cold snow claiming that they're part of a movement of pushing back the federal government. Professor Kennedy, why does a gun give them that sense that they're freedom fighters when under any other circumstances they would just be folks with pickup trucks stalled in a snowbank in Burns, Oregon?
You're not going to ask any hard ones, are you?
No, no hard ones.
I grew up shooting too, right? So I get how attractive a lot of this is. But on that one, I'll just say that apparently one of the issues here is that if you're too obsessed with weaponry, you forget to bring food, right? So this is really not a good prescription for an insurgent movement, right? When you have to be using the subsidized arms of the state to have people ship supplies from Amazon to you, this is not what Mao was all about, right? So we can let that one go. What I really want to do here, I want to draw some connections between this subject and some really important themes that the rest of the day has been focusing on. And if you are thick enough in this, these are very, very evident connections. But since most people don't live this every day, let me draw attention to a couple of things. So Ada's story is horrific. And it's also remarkably, remarkably common. So this is a story of a woman who ended up being saddled with her alleged loved one's firearm. As far as we know, this was not a gun that was used to hurt or kill anybody. But I work mostly with, let's call it inner city violence. These are places where people are dropping like flies. And very little of the gun acquisition there is legal. It's trafficked, it's stolen, it's straw purchased, it's all that sort of thing. And I first encountered Lipstick a year or so ago and was completely blown away by it because it is an example of not just community action, but in this instance, community action led by community, female community figures in these settings, organizing themselves to say to their networks, don't do this. And not just because you'll get caught, but because you're going to help somebody else get hurt. And none of us want that. Mothers particularly have moral standing here. So wonkishly, this is what academics call informal social control. See, I can do it when I want to.
But let's just distinguish that from the traditional wonkishness. You're talking about very hyper-human targeting of where violence occurs, not blanket sort of carpet bombing that we're used to seeing among wonk discussions that say, let's turn Baltimore into a fortress, for instance.
So I don't actually think that comes from the wonks, but in any case.
Yeah.
So let me take exactly those two steps. So I spent a lot of time with law enforcement, and if you say to law enforcement, mothers in the community have much more power to actually affect these violence dynamics than you with the gun and the badge do. They do not believe you, right? So let me do an exercise with you I do with them. Raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of the police. Yeah, thanks. Down. Raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of your mother. Right? That's how communities really work. And
Brilliant.
That's great.
Wonks can have fun too.
Yeah, I agree.
So the moral power focused in the right way on this issue is tremendous, right? So thank you for that. Now
let's return to that in just a moment because that moral power is really the engine we want to mobilize here. Ada talked about, since you raised Ada's story, about being powerless. Certainly, the loss of your daughter is a experience of utter powerlessness. But you had a subsequent experience of powerlessness in attempting to advocate for your loss. Can you describe that a little bit? And then I want to ask you, Ken, as to why the law seems to support Sandy's powerlessness here.
After Jessi was killed and my husband and I decided that we would go out into the world, so to speak, and advocate for gun violence prevention, we filed a lawsuit against the organizations that sold the online ammunition to the killer. And because of a law called PLACA,
Well, before you mention PLACA,
Okay.
these are precisely the organizations, Ken, that you're watching all the time, the people who allow, you were just saying, that get these killer machines and weapons into the hands of people in communities all over America, right? Did you want to say a couple of things about that before we hear the kicker of Sandy's story?
Well, essentially, folks have to realize that these young men who are carrying these guns don't make these guns. These guns are flooding our cities from places down south that have weak gun laws, like Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina. And so until we do something about it, in Brooklyn, we had over 500 people shot last year. In Chicago, nearly 3,000 people were shot. In 2015 alone, the first 10 days of 2016, 120 people were shot in Chicago.
And that's the direct result of manufacturers marketing into these communities with the weak gun laws.
It's not just the manufacturers. These guns are being purchased online at gun shows through classified ads down south. We have got to wake up and say, wait, all of this is planned out in New York City, in Chicago, in Baltimore, and we have to do something about it. And we have to call on our elected officials to have some backbone and save American lives.
Or you file a lawsuit. You've got a loss. You've
Yes.
got a daughter who's dead.
Yes.
You've got a public health issue.
Yes.
You file a lawsuit. What happens?
We filed the lawsuit against the online dealers that sold over 4,000 rounds of steel-jacketed, green-tipped 223s that ripped through the seats, that ripped through the walls. And he did it online with literally a click of the mouse and not even having to produce a driver's license. No background checks, no ID. And we knew that's wrong. That's just wrong. So we filed suit not for money, but to have them change their business practices. And the suit was thrown out on its first motion, and we were ordered to pay $264,000.
Which you still owe right now.
Well, right now he reduced it. The judge was so kind that he reduced it to $203,000, which of course, no matter what, even if I had to go to prison, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to give them a dime.
Why, Ken, does the law say that if gun manufacturers and gun salespeople are insulated from these kinds of questionings of their practices, that constitutes a kind of freedom in America to keep the government off our backs?
Well, it wasn't always like that. What happened is the former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg, bankrolled a number of lawsuits against these gun manufacturers around the country. And so the gun lobby came together and they got their friends in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to pass this law in 2005 that gives them immunity with respect, with few exceptions. Like we just had a case in Wisconsin where a jury came back with a $5 million verdict. The point I'm making is that we should start a movement to stop this nonsense, to stop this bloodshed, and to vote these folks out. If they're not about saving our lives, we shouldn't have to bring lawsuits. This is just common sense. There's a young man right now in Brooklyn State Supreme waiting for his verdict. He was 14 years old. He pulled out a gun on a bus in Bed-Stuy and shot at another rival gang member. He's 14 years old. He pulled out a .357 Magnum and shot an innocent man in his head and killed him. And he's waiting to see if he's going to be convicted. We do these cases day after day, and enough is enough. We have to come together as a country, or we're going to continue to have these shootings, these mass shootings, and have these events.
From all four of you now, before we go, what hurts the most, and what do you most want to see happen in the next 5 years to make the passions that you've so articulated here come to some sort of social change? Sandy?
Well, for me, I really wanted to have it become a national issue, and the Democratic candidates have made it such. So for me, a lot of my dream has been fulfilled. Now we have to elect that Democratic candidate, and we have to vote out the GOP senators and congressmen that are still in their seats.
Reverend?
I want to see hearts changed, which will change minds, which will change behavior, which will change public policy. And I think the church is the place to do that.
David.
I'm actually feeling pretty optimistic. The world's going to hell in a handbasket out there, but I feel pretty good. And that's because for all the time I've been doing this, there's been a relatively small world of people who know, and as you say, once you see it, you can't turn away from it. There are communities all over this wonderful country where people have been sentenced to this witch's brew of fear and danger and violence and disorder, over-policing, under-protection, and broken relationships between the state and the people who need state protection the most. And we have been living with this as if it's normal. And the world, the country in the last 2 years has suddenly decided that this is not okay. And it's not okay, and we can do better, and we can only do better if the center of gravity insists on it, and I actually think that that's happening.
Ken.
In November, a 9-year-old boy in Chicago named Tayshawn Lee was playing on a swing, middle of the day. He was lured into an alley by gang members and executed in broad daylight at the age of 9 and killed. We need to look at those killings like that and say, this is insane. Not here, not in our country. In Brooklyn, a 1-year-old baby was shot and killed in Brownsville because someone was trying to shoot his father. These lives matter. They may be poor black boys and black men, but they're Americans. And they're our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our neighbors. And we need to slow it down.
This is a sacred place. This is a sacred moment. The exploration of justice in Plato's time was very, very tangible, even though we understand Plato's search for justice to be some sort of abstract philosophical inquiry. In fact, it was deeply rooted in what is real in the world. Just as my children ask me, what is justice in America, Dad and Mom? And I have such a difficult time answering that question. I used to do classic old-style film photography where you develop the image in a bath, and the image would suddenly come into focus in the fluid as you added the chemicals. And I think the discussion that we've been having today about justice produces an image of American history that we can never, ever forget. That we are a violent nation. That we are a nation who is still fighting the racial battles of 100 years ago. You see it in the faces in prison. You see it in the violence and the impulse to violence in law enforcement. We have to recognize that those battles don't just go away by sociology. We have to choose, every single one of us, white and black. The search for justice is that choosing. I thank Tina Brown for allowing me to come here and this terrific panel, and to all of you, thanks so much.